struggle for African Americans, although we'll see that the issue of police brutality is not an issue that only affects African Americans, but for African Americans, the struggle with and against police brutality is really as old as the police itself. I think there is a way that often when we see incidents like those that led to the death of Mike Brown in Missouri or Eric Gardner that have recently been in the news, we have a sense of somehow that these are isolated and new events. But in fact, police brutality is a subject, a concern that African Americans have struggled with for well over 100 years. They have documented it in film, they have documented in literature and art, struggling with it politically. And so part of what I'd like to do briefly is just give you a little bit of a sense of that struggle with and against police brutality, thinking about specifically from a perspective of African Americans, but again, as I said, it is not an issue that only deals with African Americans. So when we think about policing, one thing we have to recognize is the police come out of a military model. Whether you are thinking about the London Metropolitan Police or you're thinking about the French model of police, or what I would suggest is another model of policing that comes out of the history of the United States, which is policing slaves and policing African Americans who are enslaved in the United States. The police became central then, not only in preserving law and order, but in social and racial control. We have to recognize that policing law and order historically for African Americans has meant policing white supremacy, right? And so for African Americans then, beginning in the era of slavery, policing often meant watching, surveilling, prohibiting the movement and the motion of African Americans, determining where they can and cannot go. In other words, they policed race, place, gender, space. Where were you supposed to be? Where was your status in society? And that was not just based on race, but we'll see it's also based on gender. Right? So for many African Americans then, the idea of policing had been, from its inception, connected to ideas of keeping down insurrection, keeping African Americans from freedom, from mobility, from equality. Right? This is the idea of a slave patrol, for instance, that would monitor your every movement, where you could or could not be. And much of policing, I think, for African Americans has had this model. And it's clear that the social control function of policing is not one just for African Americans. Many scholars have written about the police as, quote, protectors of privilege, of policing a class society, of, in other words, maintaining order, in other words, the status quo. And in a nation that has been founded upon white supremacy, we have to recognize much of that has been the racial subordination of people of color. So for many African Americans then, their relationship with the police has historically been an antagonistic one. It's not surprising. We should keep in mind then, for instance, when police were maintaining law and order, they were upholding segregation. They were upholding the idea that you should not have access to education. You should not have access to public parks. You should not have access to buses and schools. And so when African Americans, for instance, more concretely, people like Isaac Woodard, who in the World War II era resisted segregation, said he would not move from a seat, try to challenge segregation on a bus, was beaten, his eyes gouged out by the police. Again, police brutality is not a new concern. Right? We can recognize that policing has been central in terms of maintaining order to this idea of law. Right? That is a law founded on white supremacy. And so for many African Americans, historically, it becomes quite clear that law and justice are not the same thing. Right? And I think there is a way that often in our discussions of maintaining the rule of law and saying simply to obey the law, we have forgotten what many African Americans have known for many decades, which is not just a question of what does the law say, but is the law just? Particularly in a nation that we know said slavery was just, said segregation was just, said only some Americans or people could come to become Americans, right, under the National Origins Act. Who could even come to America is based on race, right? We know also that through cases like Plessy v. Ferguson, or who could become a citizen or not in the United States, the idea of law has been deeply imbricated in the idea of white supremacy. So for many African Americans, again, when they are encountering the law, there's really a real question about justice. And so for many African Americans, it's become clear, and it has been clear historically, this is in fact where that common saying, no justice, no peace, comes from. That without justice, there cannot be peace. And when we think about the police and we think about policing, we have to recognize fundamentally it is based on violence, it is based on force. Now, the issue of police brutality is often the issue described as unnecessary or excessive force, right? But for African Americans, historically, police brutality has really encompassed a wider range of actions than simply thinking about the level of force used or whether it was necessary or not. For African Americans, it has typically been a case of being over-policed and underprotected. In other words, subject to heightened surveillance, unequal court systems, an inequitable system of justice, right? We recognize then that policing, not crime waves, but what I would argue are really arrest waves, have been central to mass incarceration. Large numbers of people of color disproportionately arrested. And here, the issue of crime can be complex. We often think about the question of crime, but we fail to recognize that in some ways it is police, by who they arrest or not, that generate crime, right? In other words, focusing on crime alone doesn't help us really get to the issue of police brutality. Instead, what it does is help us focus on the behaviors of those being policed. What did they or didn't they do? But I think if we focus more on the question of arrest, it helps us think more about what is it that the police are or are not doing. When do they use discretion or not? That is, choose to arrest someone or not. How is force and how is violence used? And fundamentally, what kind of society do we live in? And what kind of society do we want to live in? One that is based on force, violence, undergirding the rule of law, or one based on peace, justice, and affirmation of life. And for many African Americans, this has been the central crux of their struggle against police brutality. Central to civil rights, central to freedom, central to equality. We should recognize that there are few, if any, African American leaders over the course of the 20th century, if not beyond, that have not engaged this issue. People like Martin Luther King in his letter from a Birmingham jail, even his I Have a Dream speech. We often focus on the end part where he says, focusing on the color of people's skin rather than the content of their character. But he also talks about police brutality in that I Have a Dream speech. In the letter from a Birmingham jail, he also talks about police brutality, pointing out that an unjust law is no law at all, right? So not only do we have to think about law, but we have to think about justice, and we have to think about how historically, whether it is through civil rights movements, through the struggle for emancipation coming out of slavery, or even now, the way in which African Americans have struggled with this question, not only of justice, but of police violence. And as I said, that's not a question that just focuses on African Americans. Oftentimes, you would get the sense that it is only African Americans who face this question of police brutality. But historically, we can recognize, for instance, many who see the modern gay civil rights liberation movement beginning in 1968 at Stonewall was an issue of police brutality. If we think about, even today, we'll recognize that transgendered people are some of the most common targets of police violence. But again, for African Americans, this question has been central to the question of equality, central to what freedom means, and fundamental to the idea of living in a society with peace and with justice. Now, much of the focus recently in terms of blacks' protest around police brutality and those who have joined them has been an assertion of the value of black lives. And that is important. But I think it's equally important to recognize that when we looked historically, protest against police brutality did not just simply assert that black lives had value, In fact, many who participated in those protests understood that inherently. That's why they were protesting. But instead, they did other things. They demanded accountability. They demanded civilian review. They demanded hiring and better training for police officers. In other words, something that sometimes seems lacking today in the movements around police brutality, they had actual demands. They wanted to hold police accountable. They wanted to change how policing was done. And fundamentally, they recognized that this was not a question of simply saying, are there a few bad apples? Are there a few rotten apples amongst this huge group? They recognized that police brutality, like those who fail to act against it, is a systemic, institutional issue fundamental to questions of freedom and equality, fundamental to civil rights, fundamental to being a human being. And so, for many, then, this question of justice, this question of police violence, is one that touches on, again, what is someone's place in society? Where are you supposed to be in a free society? Do you have mobility? It has to deal with labor. We recognize that the police have often, particularly historically, had a high role in quelling demands for labor, better work conditions, justice. So in other words, when we think about police brutality, what I would encourage you to do is to think about it in a wider historical context. It is not just about asserting the value of life. It is recognizing all the things that feed life, and how, for many African Americans then, without a just society, as they know, there cannot be peace. And really thinking about the police and thinking about the role of violence, not only in our society, but really in the way in which it is sanctioned in our society. We have to recognize then that the police become quite powerful. To whom are they accountable? How are they held accountable? When we start to ask those questions, we can recognize that historically African Americans have protested. They have turned to civil courts, criminal courts. They have turned to the Justice Department. They have protested in the streets. And yet we know police brutality continues. In part it continues because we also have to recognize that the police in fact do maintain order. And so the challenge to police brutality is also a challenge to the order that it maintains. And frankly put, police brutality will not end until the order that it maintains is brought to an end. And so for those people who are really serious about challenging police brutality, what I would really advocate is looking historically helps us see really some of the limitations of these different strategies that people have adopted. In other words, they have got better training for police. They have hired more police of color, some of whom themselves are brutal. Right? We have to recognize while white supremacy is white supremacy, it is not only white people who uphold it or benefit from it. And so there is the way in which I think when we think about police brutality, what I would encourage you, and as I said, I'll be brief, so I'm about to stop talking. I would really encourage us to think about broadly how this issue is an issue that speaks to the kind of society we live in, the world we live in, whether we really want to live in a world where there is no accountability, a world that rests on violence and force, because we do have to recognize in the final analysis, when a policeman tells you to stop and you choose not to stop, the only thing that they have to make you stop is force, right? So we do have to recognize violence is central to policing. And it's not then just a question of excessive force or unnecessary force, but fundamentally a question of justice. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully if you guys have some questions, we can think about them more concretely. But I'll turn it over to Carolyn for now.
As I was putting together that earlier slide presentation, I realized that there were so many cases I wasn't sure like when to stop. So many recent cases of police brutality, and I made a special effort to include the faces of Black women, because I think when we talk about this topic and police brutality, we oftentimes overlook what happens with gender and the intersection of that in race. So I wanted to make a special effort to do that. But in my time with you, I've thought a lot about this topic. I'm originally from the St. Louis area, was born and raised there, and actually lived there until I was 29 and left for Notre Dame to work on completing my PhD program. And so this situation with Mike Brown really hit me in a different sort of way. It wasn't very distant. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how I got from Ferguson to here, and I want to help you understand how it's bigger than what happened to Mike Brown and police brutality. So at this point, we all pretty much know what happened on August 9th, around 3 o'clock on that Saturday afternoon, when he was shot by the police officer. He was with his friend, and he had left a store, and hundreds of people were in the street in this crowded apartment complex, and his body lay in the street for about 4 hours or more until it was removed from the street. And we all know about the protests that happened after that. But what people don't really understand, or maybe, I don't know if you knew or not, about 10 days after Mike Brown was killed, another man was shot dead by the police just a few miles from where Mike Brown was killed. That didn't get as much media attention. This was a young man, he was 25 years old, and he had stolen some donuts and an energy drink from a local store. He was known around town as somebody who had some mental health challenges. The store owner called the police. He was armed with a small pocket knife, and I understand how police can be concerned about that, because you can actually close the distance pretty quickly. If somebody's got a knife, they could be really up on you pretty quickly in stabbing you. But he was acting really erratically, and he was actually yelling, "Shoot me, shoot me, shoot me." He had mental health challenges, so they shot him. And I just kept thinking, particularly as a psychologist, there has got to be another way to resolve these problems beyond this. This can't be. So this was an ongoing problem in St. Louis, as it was all around the country. But I want to give you a little bit more understanding of Ferguson and St. Louis to give you a sense of why I think what happened there. Like I said, growing up there, it's a place where the first question people ask you when they meet you is, where did you go to high school? And I've had friends who moved there, and they said, what are you asking about high school for? You know, they didn't really get why that was so important, because it's a place where people really don't leave. They're sort of in place there. And so if you're born there, your roots are there, and you're almost like there forever in some ways. So it's that kind of place. So where did you go to high school was really important. And it also speaks to residential segregation. Because after I would leave high school, you'd get on the bus and all the white kids would be going south and all the black kids would be going north. I mean, it was that segregated. And so where you went to high school really told people a lot about your economic status and that. So I went to Southwest High School, and it was getting integrated, and then as more blacks came, then the whites fled. And that's generally how things worked there. To understand what happened with Mike Brown and to understand St. Louis, you're surrounded by this racial history, and it's all around you. Dred Scott was a slave and social activist, and he actually sued, and maybe you actually were there at the Historical Museum when that was happening, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that. But he actually lost his initial suit in the St. Louis District Court, but he wanted a second trial, and then that was overturned by the Missouri State Supreme Court. I mean, slaves were sold just on the courthouse steps in St. Louis, so that was a real deep history there. And one of the judges at the time said they, meaning blacks, had no rights which white men were bound to respect. So it was perfectly fine for Dred Scott to be never have his freedom according to the court system of that time. So very connected to that history. And Plessy v. Ferguson, another high-profile case of separate but equal facilities on trains, actually he was buried in St. Louis. So people would oftentimes, when they visit St. Louis, would visit his grave and learn about that history, that deep history of separate and equal, and how deep that was entrenched in our history. So I wasn't surprised, actually, when you have to understand the segregation that's deeply rooted, residential segregation that's deeply rooted in St. Louis and other places. This was actually a leaflet from 1916, and it actually promoted voter referendum to keep St. Louis segregated, and it actually passed. And I don't know if you can see the text at the bottom, but it says the entire block is ruined by Negro invasion. Every house marked X now occupied by Negroes. Actual photo of this place. And save your home, vote for segregation. And people did. And so St. Louis has a deep history of that. Actually, St. Louis ranks 15th. St. Louis County ranks 15th in the list of most segregated, white segregated places in the entire country. And so why that is significant is when you go to places where Mike Brown was killed, the Canfield Apartments, again, highly segregated and deeply impoverished. And I think we have to think about that when people who don't live there are policing those environments. What do they see, and how do they see the people who live there? It wasn't also surprising to me after Mike Brown was killed, a group of protesters marched 120 miles from Ferguson to the governor's mansion in Jefferson City. And as they passed through these little towns, there are a lot of little towns in St. Louis, as they passed through one town, Rosebud, there were about 200 residents who came out of their houses with Confederate flags, and they also put down fried chicken, watermelon, a 40-ounce bottle of beer, and they were waving Confederate flags saying any number of things that were not so pleasant. And so I was thinking, like, is this America, or is this 2014? Because things really hadn't changed that much. So a little bit about Ferguson by the numbers, again, to help you put this in context. And we'll talk a little bit about the police brutality end of it. But you have to understand where Mike Brown lived, and where some of my family members even now live, the average wage, the average yearly income is for about $47,000. But in the Ferguson household, it was much lower, $37,000. So it's a 24% of the people who lived in Ferguson, where Mike Brown lived below the poverty line. And so that's significant, I think. And you also have to understand how deeply institutionalized racism is there in that area. Of the number of blacks who were arrested, 408, the vast majority of the arrests in Ferguson, and I could talk a little bit about this later too, most of the people who were stopped there, who were searched there, who were arrested there were African Americans, so they were disproportionately stopped and arrested, more so than other people in the community. Other numbers you have to understand is the number 3. There were 53 officers, police officers in Ferguson. 3 of them were African American, 50 of them were white. So again, you have people who don't look like the people policing that area. And that makes a big difference in some ways. In some ways, it makes no difference the color of the police officers. Because the reality is that the St. Louis Police Department in 2014 spent $99 million. Just that was their budget. And they were also, and that doesn't count all the money they got from the federal government to provide these MRAPs and serious military grade equipments that you would see in combat zones to police city streets. So more money goes to the military. You need to understand the number 34. 34, Missouri ranks out of 48 states, Missouri ranks number 34 in fairness to school funding. So the places that Mike Brown went were really dropout factories where people weren't really being educated at all. So when his mother said, this is a big deal to get a black man through school, to get through high school, to be able to go to a community college or a technical school is a big deal. And you also have to understand the number 21. And that is the number of shots that were fired at Jack in the Box. This happened in 2000. There were some minor low-level drug dealers, and the Drug Enforcement Agency wanted to arrest them. And the police rolled up on them, shot them 21 times, killing both. One guy had nothing to do with nothing. He just happened to be in the car. And Bob McCullough, the person who was supposed to be prosecuting the Mike Brown case, in that case went to the grand jury as well, and there was no conviction, even though it was pretty clear that these guys were not trying to run over the police officers, and he actually publicly called these men who were shot by the police 21 times bums and just criminals. So it was sort of all right for them to be shot 21 times, even though they were not a threat. So you can see why people were highly upset when there was nothing happened with the grand jury in the Mike Brown situation. You need to understand the number 19, and also 19% of the general budget actually comes from fines and court fees. And so that's really significant for understanding this as well. So you have to understand, in St. Louis, some of the towns around there, they get most of their revenue, and that's how they're funded, from stopping people just randomly in the street talking. But it's just a short video clip that actually shows how St. Louis is set up in the municipalities around that, in that literally you can go one block and then you're in a whole nother municipality, and they've got a whole nother police force. And so they can stop you. So they end up stopping people who oftentimes are low income, don't have any resources, so they give you a ticket. Then you have no license and they take your license away. Then you can't get a job, and then you can't show up for court, and the fees stack up. And then you're just perpetually in a system of poverty that you can never get out of. And then you get arrested, then you have a criminal record, and it's just a downward trajectory for you. And so that is what we don't typically understand, that there's a whole system that was set up to keep people like Mike Brown and other people who lived in those communities sort of entrapped by the police. And how it really made sense for me what happened to Mike Brown happened, and also happened to other young people in that community. So my point is, I guess overall, the problem is bigger than police brutality and bigger than the police. It's a whole system that keeps people entrapped. And so that's a little bit about how I got from Ferguson in the St. Louis area to here. But I think it's more important, particularly before Dr. Adams leaves, to really be able to answer some questions about this for you, rather than to hear us talk the whole time. So I'll stop here. But I think I wanted to say one more thing that I wanted to leave you with is this. Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe.
Is this on? Oh. Hi, my name is Brennan Todfus. I'm a senior here and a history major. I wanted to ask a question based off of something that I felt you guys both pointed out, that the problem seems to be a little bit bigger than police brutality on its own. And so with that in mind, with violence growing as a trend, and just focusing on America right now, not going outside of the country, do you feel that the focus should be on police brutality, or should we be focusing on something larger, since obviously the scope of it is much bigger? And also on that, do you believe that with the mass media frenzy that's going on right now with Ferguson and the recent cases that we've had, is this creating a whole new genre of violence that's taken away the focus from what would be the larger picture?
I don't know if is it? Yes, okay, or maybe my voice is just loud. Probably not that. Okay, so I think what I would say is the one leads to the other. In other words, we do live in a violent society. We live in a nation, of just, a bit over 400 million people and over 300 million guns. We live in a violent society. But I do think that the issue of police brutality and focusing on it specifically is one that can lead you to these other issues. In other words, part of what I mean to say in the struggle for African Americans historically around police brutality is because they recognize that challenging police brutality was also a way to challenge law, was a way to challenge the courts and the justice system, was a way also to think about mobility, race and space, right? When you start to think about policing, part of what they're also policing is not just necessarily the body of law that exists, but ideas of who is supposed to be where and when, right? What does that have to do with the color of your skin, the way that you're dressed, whether you're male, female? So many African Americans recognize that in struggling around police brutality, struggling with it and against it, is not really just thinking about the police, that's central, but recognizes then that it is a way to think about that entire order that is maintained by the police and the violence that comes through brutality. So I would actually argue that it's not a one or the other, but that the one can lead to the other. I would also suggest that when you begin to think about police brutality, you will soon begin to recognize that it is not an issue that is isolated into the United States. In other words, the United States has taken policing and its policing practices and expanded them throughout the globe. On the other hand, much of how police practice has been developed has been not only out of police function, but out of military function. So the two go hand in hand. And so there is a way that looking at police brutality not only takes you to these larger issues in the United States, but it also takes you to larger issues globally about police function, violence, society, order, place, power, ultimately.
And I guess I would say too that we hear a lot about violence, but actually according to the national statistics, violence levels are really dropping. I think it's just pockets of violence, certainly. Last statistics I can think of, about 16,000 people were murdered in 1 year. 8,000 were African Americans. So it's like we need the police, but we also need it to be in a way that, like you said, just not over-policing and under-protecting. So I think it's way complex.
And what I would add to that in terms of violence is, your point is an important one. Despite what the public perception is, crime is actually declining, even using police statistics. Crime is declining since the 1970s in the United States. Most murders are more directly. Most deaths by gun in the United States are not murder, but are suicide, and are overwhelmingly white people, not black people, or people of color at all. So there is a way that I think if you look at violence, you can look at larger issues, but there is also an additional concern, which is that I think there is a perception also that policing is extremely dangerous. And in some ways, frankly, it is. But it also is the case that if you look statistically, it is perhaps more dangerous in the United States to be a gardener, a garbage collector, or anything like that than it is to be a policeman or woman in that case.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just hold it. So, my question is about the hashtag that you've seen on social media and Facebook, Black Lives Matter, because I think that, just in our day, social media has become the venue for youth and us young people to really express ourselves and to assert our standings. And with Black Lives Matter, we've seen a hashtag of All Lives Matter and another hashtag of Criming While White, which is when white people talk about the crimes that they've done and have not been caught for. So my question is this, and I can start by saying, of course, all lives matter, but what does it mean when people say not just Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, and what is the importance of the hashtag Black Lives Matter for not only black people and black youth, but everyone? So, yeah.
I immediately think of Anna Julia Cooper, who you may not know, but was an African-American educator, born a slave, became central in women's and African-American politics at the turn of the last century. And she wrote numerous works. One of them was A Voice from the South, but she also said, quite frankly, that women's cause, and thinking specifically about African-American women, she said, their cause is one and universal. In other words, what she meant to say then is that you can focus on African American women specifically and recognize that their experience does speak to universal and broad claims. For some reason, there is this idea that if we talk about anything specifically as a black person, that's narrow, that's small. Black people don't have anything to do with anything but black people. How does that happen? So there is a way that I think we have to recognize we can focus specifically on black lives and get to universal issues. I mean, what was the civil rights movement, if not that? A movement that sparks and adds to women's liberation, gay liberation movements, labor movements. So there is a way that you can assert that Black Lives Matter, recognizing that all life has value, but it doesn't mean that we cannot think about the concerns as black people that face black people and other people as well. There are things that are in common, but there are also some disparate and different things as well. The history, I think, from which African Americans come to police brutality is one that cannot be dismissed. And so when people are asserting that Black Lives Matter, part of what they are also asserting is really an idea about where are we in this society that we live, where whether it's through poverty, through mass incarceration, whether it is through homelessness and hunger, whether it is through illness and life expectancy, no matter how you cut it, it's not hard to see that black lives matter less than other people's lives matter. We also have to recognize women's lives matter less than men's lives in this country. So it's not just the case that Black Lives Matter is only about black people, but we can recognize that looking at that issue is a universal issue. And you don't have to be scared to embrace that, I think. So with that in mind and the clock in mind, I'll be brief and turn it to you.
We'll take the next person, but I guess I would just say to that, we can't assume that hashtag act is real act. There's got to be something behind that too.
Thanks for coming here today for both of you guys. So touching on your both of your points, yours on the historical side of what has worked and what hasn't worked, and yours and that these issues are systematic. What can we do on a policy side that either hasn't been tried in the past and maybe is a good strategy in current times, or has worked previously that maybe we can do today to dismantle some of the systematic systems and whatnot?
That is such a great question, and I think about the Ferguson. It doesn't matter what kind of police you have there if the whole system is based upon keeping that town afloat is by stopping people for bogus traffic. How do you fix a whole system? And so that's a good, I think just broadly we got to deal with poverty and what it means when people have criminal records and dealing with the prison industrial complex deeply at the root of all this. So poverty, figuring out ways to deal with poverty in ways that make sense rather than individual, like just go get a job when there are no jobs here to get.
No, I think that's a difficult question, because if you look historically, many of the things that African Americans have advocated to try and curb police brutality have, to some degree, been put in place. Now, whether they are put in place and acted upon in good faith is another question. But more officers of color have been hired, even though police forces remain overwhelmingly white in the nation. There have been efforts to train and retrain police. So you can note, for instance, with Eric Gardner, when he was killed using a chokehold that was outlawed for decades, they said immediately we would retrain 35,000 police officers in New York to tell them not to use a chokehold. So training, hiring more police officers, civilian review, for instance, has been something that has been advocated and not, I think, really put into place with any real attempts, I think. There are some historical accounts, but the fundamental question is one of who rules the police? To whom are they accountable? And I think increasingly it is clear they are accountable to no one but themselves. You cannot bring them to justice in criminal cases, in civil cases. You can remove police chiefs, but how do you change the whole structure of policing? And you can see that even most notably in Seattle, right, where you have had a police force that is under federal injunction, even as they get new gear, lots and lots of new gear and militarized gear. But how do you hold them accountable? To whom are they accountable? There is an idea that policing is somehow so difficult, so split-second decision that we cannot leave it to people who are not police to determine whether they are right or wrong. I always find that laughable. As a faculty member, if I were to come in a class and say, teaching is highly specialized, it takes lots of training and education, and it is complex and has an expertise that many of you cannot understand, there is no way that a student can evaluate me. You would look at me as if I was crazy. Yet, when the police say that, we nod as though that is true. How is it that the police are not accountable? How is it that there is no real oversight to the police? So I think when you begin there, you can begin moving towards that, but it is also clear, as Carolyn suggests, that it is the order that they are maintaining from which they derive their power. So really and fundamentally, it is when you begin to challenge and change the very fundamental and structure of what America is, questions of racial control, social control, place, that you can begin to deal not only with police brutality, but the order that they maintain. Right?
Thank you.
These questions are wonderful, and we just want to be respectful of time, so we have time for about one more question. Okay, is that okay with you?
I know you have to.
And to be clear, for those of you who are in line, I have to go to class. Dr. West is happy to answer questions that you may have.
I guess I am.
Not all day, not all day, but
Yeah.
to some degree.
Okay,
Maybe the people-
I just want to thank both of you for speaking with us. This is an excellent thing that you were doing, because it's opening up dialogue, which I think is definitely needed, which kind of leads into my question with media and how they portray what's going on and how they portray people of color. And my question is, what is the best way to open up dialogue? Because I noticed certain things on social media and things people are saying, and I got to tell you, like, it's a sock to the gut how ignorant some people can be. So what would be your advice to open up dialogue?
Got to meet people where they are. And, educate where they are, because you can't someplace where they're not and say, okay, you believe this, let's talk about the history or why things are the way they are, because there's got to be back and forth.
I guess what I would say is I think dialogue is important. We're here. But at the same time, I fundamentally think if we sit here and we talk about this and then we leave and we go back to whatever we were doing, so what? So there is really a question not only of dialogue, but of action. And so there, I think when you begin to focus on action, that helps you think about dialogue. Frankly, I believe, there is that saying, them with ears, let them hear. Or as we would say back home in Kentucky, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So in other words, there are some people there is no reason to waste your time arguing with. You do not go to a Klan rally and think you're going to change their mind. Now, at the same time, there are places where you can, wherever you are at, begin to make changes. Begin to change first in your own mindset, but you can begin to talk with other people. You can begin to organize with other people. And I think you begin there. And so there is also a way that I fundamentally see how many people have become mobilized thinking about Ferguson and are only thinking about Ferguson. What is happening in Tacoma? What is happening in Seattle? What is happening in the communities that we live in? And so when we begin to move just beyond dialogue, we can talk all day. But if we're not actually doing something, what will change? And I'm not saying that talking isn't doing something, to be clear, but I am saying that there has to be more than dialogue. You know, the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois once said, knowledge without action doesn't get you anywhere.
Well, thank you so much for the thoughtful and detailed speeches that you guys just gave. And I have a question. In terms of the relation between law enforcement and minority communities, in terms of police brutalities, what is the biggest change this country has had since the civil rights movement? And also, are you hopeful that the fundamental questions that we are having right now would finally be answered by action? Thank you.
I don't think it's, I wish that it was more simple. But it's not in terms of changes with law enforcement. It's almost like things really haven't changed. When you think about historically, law enforcement came from Klan members, and the law enforcement actually was used when they needed workers. They would just arrest large numbers of people to be those workers on trumped up charges of crime. So there really wasn't any crime, but it was all really manufactured. And so until we can kind of grapple with that history and how it's interconnected to other systems in our larger culture, I don't think anything is going to change much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate this.
Last question.
I was thinking, if there are people of color, should there also be people of no color?
Well, it would be nice, but I think color is so socially constructed in our society. I think we're all pretty much human beings, but it's what our society makes of race. Because race is really a social construct, and so it's what our society makes of that makes us different. If we didn't have that, I think we'd be fine, but I don't see that disappearing anytime soon.
That's sort of the binary.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it does. It makes it possible because we come with a set of attitudes that we just can't get past. And they're deeply embedded. It's all implicit racism. So we're not there yet. I don't see that happening in my lifetime. But
so one of the people before she left, or maybe she's still here, anyway, brought up the Black Lives versus All Lives Matter hashtag. And one of the things that I was particularly interested in trying to understand is I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on the idea, because there's this like idea kind of going around that the media coverage is of all of these police brutalities towards African Americans is perpetuating racism by constantly focusing on that particular issue. And I just kind of wanted to know
Well,
what
it's
your
going to
thoughts.
exist whether we talk about it or not. I don't think the
Right.
media, well, I think the media certainly gets ratings from it. And I imagine they were rooting for a riot in Ferguson because more eyeballs would be on the TV. But I don't think that's what kind of, because these problems are so deeply entrenched, they're going to, not talking about them is not going to make them not go away. It just makes them continue to be invisible.
And then the follow-up thing is, another thing that I particularly have heard, I'm from the South, so one of the things I keep hearing is why don't black people protest like they did in Ferguson when something like that happens to a white person?
Go with that. I'm not seeing large numbers of them being choked. They, certainly are, and I think a lot of it has to do with poverty, and it does happen, but disproportionately, it happens to people of color, and so that's where the focus tends to be, and so just policing is different. You can go shoot up a movie theater, and the police manage to take those people into custody without killing them, but they can't take into custody unarmed people or 12-year-olds with toy guns. I mean, so there's a different set of issues there. So it's not like, I think that just is kind of a red herring to kind of draw the attention elsewhere from where it actually really needs to be.
Like
Now
to
let's say
detract
we
from
can
the
deal with
focus.
those issues too.
Thanks. I'm sorry, that is all that we do have time for today. I know we got to be respectful of the time. If we could give a huge round of applause to Dr. Carolyn West, please. Thank you. And thank you all for coming today.